Donald Trump is no stranger to extravagance, but this time he's taking it straight to the White House. Reports reveal he's secretly building a massive $250 million ballroom inside the White House, and the world can't stop asking, why does he need it, and who's paying for it? The unprecedented demolition. When footage first emerged on October 20th, 2025, showing excavators tearing into the facade of the White House's East Wing, with windows dangling precariously and rubble accumulating on what was once pristine government grounds, the nation collectively gasped in disbelief. What Americans were witnessing wasn't just another routine renovation of their most iconic residence, it was the complete and total demolition of an 83-year-old structure that had stood as a symbol of American democracy through World War II, the Cold War, and countless presidential administrations. This wasn't a careful restoration or a thoughtful preservation project. This was, quite literally, a wrecking ball being taken to American history. The story actually begins months earlier, on July 31st, 2025, when President Donald Trump announced plans for what he called a White House State Ballroom, a massive new addition to the White House that would dwarf anything that had come before it. Initially described as a $200 million project that would be built near but not touching the existing structure, Trump painted a picture of a respectful addition that would simply provide more space for state dinners and formal gatherings. He emphasized repeatedly that it would be funded entirely by what he termed patriot donors and his own personal contributions, promising that not a single taxpayer dollar would be involved. But as summer turned to fall, and as construction crews began arriving at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue with increasing frequency, it became abundantly clear that what Trump had described and what was actually happening were two entirely different things. The project had quietly escalated from $200 million to $250 million, and Trump himself would later reference $300 million in his defenses of the work. More significantly, that promise of building near but not touching the existing structure had been completely abandoned. Instead, administration officials told CBS that modernization for security and technology necessitated full demolition of the entire East Wing. Let's be absolutely clear about what was being destroyed here. The East Wing of the White House isn't just any building. It was originally constructed in 1902 under President Theodore Roosevelt and was significantly expanded in 1942 under Franklin D. Roosevelt during the darkest days of World War II. For 83 years, this wing had served as the social hub of the White House, housing the offices of the First Lady, a movie theater where presidents and their families had watched films for generations, and the graphics and calligraphy office that had produced countless official documents and invitations. Perhaps most critically, the East Wing sits directly above the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, the secure bunker where the president and key staff would shelter during national emergencies. When those excavators started their work on October 20th, they weren't just demolishing a building. They were erasing decades of American history, memories of countless state functions, and a structure that had witnessed some of the most pivotal moments in our nation's story. The National Trust for Historic Preservation immediately issued a letter on October 22nd demanding a halt for legally required public review, arguing that as a national historic landmark, the White House required proper consultation and oversight before such dramatic alterations could proceed. But here's where the story takes an even more troubling turn. The demolition had begun without any plans being submitted to the National Capital Planning Commission, the federal body specifically tasked with overseeing building projects in Washington, D.C. Think about that for a moment. The most significant structural change to the White House since Harry Truman completely gutted and rebuilt the mansion's interior in 1948 was proceeding without the oversight that would be required for virtually any other federal building project in the nation's capital. White House officials, including NCPC Chair Will Scharf, a Trump appointee, countered that the commission had no authority over demolition or site preparation, only final construction plans. They argued that under the Presidential Residences Act of 1962, the president has exclusive control over the White House grounds, and that they fully intended to submit construction plans once the demolition and site preparation were complete. But this interpretation of the law struck many legal experts and preservation advocates as, at best, a creative reading of the regulations, and at worst, a deliberate attempt to circumvent. Proper oversight and public input. The optics couldn't have been worse, as those images of dangling windows and crumbling walls circulated on social media and news outlets, Americans were dealing with another crisis entirely, a federal government shutdown that had begun affecting services and leaving thousands of federal workers uncertain about their paychecks. The juxtaposition was stark and, for many, deeply offensive. Essential government services were suspended, but construction on a massive presidential ballroom, one that many viewed as a vanity project, continued continued unabated with private crews working around the clock. Former First Lady Hillary Clinton captured the mood of millions of Americans when she posted on social media, "It's your house and he's destroying it." That simple message resonated because it touched on something fundamental. The White House doesn't belong to whoever happens to occupy it at any given moment. It belongs to all Americans. It's a symbol of our democracy, our values, and our shared history. And watching it being torn apart, quite literally, felt to many like an assault on those very principles. Presidential historian Jonathan Alter went even further, calling the demolition the perfect symbol of the Trump administration, and likening it to a wrecking ball being taken not just to the building, but to the rule of law itself. His comments reflected a growing sentiment that this wasn't really about modernization or improved event space. It was about one man's desire to remake America's most iconic building in his own image. Consequences and precedents be damned. The scope of what Trump envisioned was genuinely breathtaking in its ambition, even if you set aside all the controversy for a moment. The new ballroom would span approximately 90,000 square feet in total, with the ballroom space itself covering around 25,000 square feet, making it one of the largest single rooms in any government building in America. It would be capable of seating up to 999 people for formal dinners, a massive increase from the current East Room's capacity of around 200 guests. To put that in perspective, this single room would be larger than many entire houses, and it would dwarf the existing White House structure, which totals only about 55,000 square feet. Renderings released by the White House showed a gilded, Versailles-inspired interior with extensive gold leafing, massive crystal chandeliers, and ornate decorative elements that seemed more appropriate for a European palace than for what has traditionally been called the People's House. The design work was being handled by McCreary Architects, with construction managed by Clark Construction, both well-regarded firms in their fields. But the aesthetic choices reflected Trump's personal taste, a taste shaped by his Mar-a-Lago estate and his various luxury properties around the world, rather than any particular deference to the White House's existing neoclassical architecture. The National Trust for Historic Preservation warned that a structure of this size and ornate design would overwhelm the existing White House, fundamentally altering not just the building's footprint, but its entire character and presence on the National Mall. Critics pointed out the irony that Trump, who had once defended Confederate monuments by arguing they represented collective history that must be preserved, was now dismissing the East Wing as ugly and not much worth preserving. The construction timeline was ambitious almost to the point of recklessness. Groundbreaking had occurred in September 2025, demolition started on October 20th, and the entire East Wing was expected to be completely razed by late October. The full project wasn't scheduled for completion until September 2027, meaning that for nearly 2 years, the White House would be an active construction site, with all the noise, disruption, security complications, and visual blight that entails. But perhaps nothing captured the sense of loss and violation better than the actual photographs that emerged from the demolition site. News outlets like the Associated Press and PBS published striking images showing the East Wing mid-destruction, windows hanging at odd angles, walls exposing interior spaces that had been hidden for decades, construction equipment surrounding what had always been one of the most carefully protected buildings in America. These weren't sanitized architectural renderings or carefully staged photo opportunities. These were raw, almost painful images of American heritage being systematically dismantled. A recent YouGov poll found that 53% of Americans disapproved of the East Wing demolition, with only 24% approving. When asked about the overall ballroom project, the numbers were similarly negative, 33% approved while 50% disapproved. These weren't the polls of a popular modernization project embraced by a grateful nation. These were the numbers of a deeply divisive action that most Americans viewed with skepticism at best and outright hostility at worst. The money trail and donor influence. Now, if the demolition itself wasn't controversial enough, the story of how this massive project was being funded opened up an entirely new dimension of concern and criticism. Remember, Trump had promised from the very beginning that this would be a purely private endeavor. No taxpayer dollars would be involved, and the entire cost would be covered by generous donors and his own contributions. On its face, this might sound like a generous offer, sparing American taxpayers from footing a massive bill during economically uncertain times. But as the details emerged about exactly who these donors were and what they might be hoping to gain from their generosity, the picture became considerably murkier. On October 22, 2025, the White House released a list of 37 donors who had contributed to the ballroom project. Reading through that list was like scrolling through a who's who of American corporate power and political influence. There were the tech giants, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Meta, companies that collectively wield more economic power than many nations and whose business interests intersect with federal policy policy in countless ways. There were defense contractors like Lockheed Martin, companies that depend on billions of dollars in government contracts and whose bottom lines are directly affected by defense policy decisions made in the White House. The cryptocurrency industry was heavily represented, with Coinbase, Ripple, Tether, and the Winklevoss brothers all making contributions. This was particularly notable given the Trump administration's generally favorable stance toward cryptocurrency regulation, or rather, its resistance to increased regulation. Were these donations simply expressions of patriotism, as the White House claimed, or were they investments in maintaining favorable regulatory treatment? Then there were the political insiders who had donated. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and Small Business Administration head Kelly Loeffler both appeared on the donor list, individuals who were actively serving in the Trump administration while simultaneously funding a personal project of the president's. The Adelson family, longtime Republican mega-donors, had contributed as well, continuing their pattern of using their vast wealth to maintain proximity to political power. One particularly interesting element of the funding puzzle was that approximately $22 million of the total cost came from a settlement Trump had received in a 2021 lawsuit he had filed against YouTube. So while Trump claimed to be making personal contributions to the project, at least a portion of that money had come from a legal settlement rather than directly from his own pocket. The White House insisted that all of this was perfectly above board. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt characterized the donations as generous patriotism, arguing that these donors were simply Americans who wanted to contribute to enhancing a national treasure. She pointed out that the alternative would have been using taxpayer dollars during a time when many Americans were struggling economically, and she framed the private funding as a way of taking that burden off ordinary citizens. But critics weren't buying it. The concern wasn't just that wealthy individuals and powerful corporations were funding a presidential vanity project. It was the appearance, and potentially the reality, of a quid pro quo arrangement. When companies like Lockheed Martin, which holds billions of dollars in defense contracts, or Palantir, which has extensive government data contracts, make substantial donations to fund a president's personal project, it's impossible not to wonder what they might be expecting in return. The optics were made even worse when news broke that Trump had hosted a donor dinner at the White House, bringing together many of these major contributors for what was described as an appreciation event. The image of the President of the United States hosting wealthy donors and corporate executives, many of whom had significant business before the federal government, in the very building they had helped fund renovations for, struck many observers as deeply troubling, regardless of whether any explicit deals were being cut. Human rights lawyer Qasim Rashid highlighted the inequality aspect of the controversy, pointing out that America was experiencing record-high wealth gaps, with millions of Americans struggling with housing costs, healthcare expenses, and food insecurity, while hundreds of millions of dollars were being directed toward what he characterized as a vanity project. The juxtaposition was stark. Ordinary Americans were dealing with real economic hardship, while the wealthy elite were funding gilded ballrooms. It's worth putting this in historical context to understand just how unusual this funding arrangement really was. When you look back at major White House renovations throughout history, they've typically been funded through a combination of federal appropriations and, occasionally, private donations managed through arm's-length foundations with strict ethical guidelines. Truman's massive 1948 renovation, which included gutting the entire interior of the White House for safety reasons, was funded through federal appropriations. John F. Kennedy's renovations in the 1960s, which included work on the West Wing and various improvements throughout the mansion, were funded through a mix of federal money and donations managed by the White House Historical Association, an independent nonprofit specifically created to maintain distance between donors and the sitting president. What made the Trump ballroom funding different was the direct connection between the donors and the sitting president, the lack of any independent oversight body managing the donations, and the sheer scale of individual contributions from entities with clear business interests affected by federal policy. It wasn't technically illegal. The White House was correct that private funding was permitted, but it shattered norms that had existed for decades precisely to avoid even the appearance of wealthy individuals buying influence with the president. The crypto industry's involvement was particularly eyebrow-raising given subsequent events. Not long after the donor list was released, Trump granted a pardon to Changpeng Zhao, the founder of cryptocurrency exchange Binance, who had pleaded guilty to money laundering charges. Now there's no direct evidence that Zhao's pardon was connected to crypto industry donations to the ballroom project. Correlation doesn't equal causation, but the timing and the interconnected nature of Trump's relationship with the crypto industry made it impossible for critics not to draw connections, whether fair or not. Social media posts highlighted these concerns, with users pointing out the various ways Trump and his family had profited from cryptocurrency ventures, including the launch of the Trump Memcoin just days before his inauguration speculation, which had briefly pushed valuations of Trump-associated crypto holdings into the billions of dollars. The family's involvement in crypto wasn't just casual interest, it was active participation in an industry that stood to benefit enormously from favorable regulatory treatment. Adding another layer of complexity, Trump's personal net worth had surged dramatically during his second presidency, growing by approximately $3 billion between January and September 2025. Much of this growth was attributed to cryptocurrency holdings and ventures, with some estimates suggesting crypto comprised up to 37% of his total wealth by March 2025. So here was a president who was personally profiting enormously from an industry that was simultaneously funding one of his pet projects, while that same industry was subject to regulatory decisions made by his administration. Trump family members were also deeply involved in crypto ventures, with sons Don Jr., Eric, and Barron all participating in various cryptocurrency and licensing deals. Reports indicated that the family had secured $3.4 billion in profits since the election, raising further questions about whether the presidency was being used, consciously or not, to advance family business interests. International deals added yet another dimension to the wealth accumulation story. Trump's licensing business had secured massive projects in the Persian Gulf, including a $5.5 billion villa development in Qatar and a $1 billion project in Jeddah. These weren't just business deals, they were arrangements with foreign governments and entities that had their own interests in US foreign policy. And while there's no evidence of direct quid pro quo arrangements, the potential for conflicts of interest was undeniable and unprecedented in modern American history. The White House ballroom donors also included communications companies like Comcast, which owns NBC and other major media properties. Media companies funding presidential projects while simultaneously covering that president's administration raised obvious questions about editorial independence and the potential for conflicts of interest in news coverage. What made all of this particularly galling to critics was the timing. This was happening during a federal government shutdown, when thousands of federal workers were facing uncertainty about their paychecks and essential services were being curtailed. The image of wealthy corporations and billionaires funding a lavish ballroom while ordinary government workers struggled was, to many Americans, emblematic of skewed priorities and a government that served the wealthy rather than ordinary citizens. Democrats in Congress had attempted to tie government funding bills to halting the ballroom project, but these efforts failed, in part because Republicans argued that since the project was privately funded, Congress had no authority to interfere. This created a strange situation where a major alteration to a national landmark, the White House, was proceeding without any real congressional oversight or approval, simply because it was being paid for with private money rather than public funds. The battle for America's House. As October 2025 drew to a close with the East Wing reduced to rubble and steel girders, the ballroom controversy had evolved from a debate about architecture and historic preservation into something much larger, a proxy war over competing visions of America itself, the proper role of wealth in politics, and whether presidential power should be constrained by norms and traditions or limited only by the technical boundaries of law. The criticism came from predictable quarters, but also from some surprising ones. Former Representative Joe Walsh, a conservative who had previously supported Trump, was among the most vocal critics, calling the demolition an utter desecration and vowing that if elected president in 2028, he would bulldoze the new ballroom. His visceral reaction reflected a broader sentiment among many conservatives who believed in respecting institutions and traditions, that Trump had crossed a line that went beyond partisan politics. But it was the arguments from supporters of the project that revealed perhaps the most interesting aspects of this controversy. They pointed out correctly that the White House had undergone significant changes throughout its history, and that past presidents had made alterations that were controversial in their time, but came to be accepted or even celebrated. They noted that Harry Truman had completely gutted the White House interior in 1948, removing everything down to the exterior walls due to safety concerns, and that today this is viewed as a necessary preservation that saved the building from potential collapse. Franklin D. Roosevelt had added the East Wing itself in 1942 during World War II, expanding the White House's footprint to accommodate growing administrative needs and to provide space for the emergency bunker. Theodore Roosevelt had added the West Wing in 1902, fundamentally changing how the White House functioned by creating dedicated office space separate from the residential areas. Each of these changes had been significant and, in their own ways, controversial. Some former White House staff members, including Anita McBride, who had worked in multiple administrations, supported the concept of expanded event space, noting that the current limitations often forced the use of temporary temporary tents for large events which were expensive, less elegant and complicated from a security standpoint. Martin Mongiello, a former White House chef who had served under 7 presidents, argued that enhanced event hosting capabilities could actually pay for itself over time through improved diplomatic functions and state visits. The White House's communications team worked to frame the criticism as partisan hysteria. They characterized the backlash as fake outrage and manufactured outrage from unhinged leftists, arguing that the same people criticizing Trump's ballroom had said nothing about previous presidential renovations. They pointed to Obama's Rose Garden renovation and various updates made during the Biden administration, though critics were quick to note that these were minor landscaping and maintenance projects that didn't involve demolishing historic structures. On social media, the divide was stark and often vitriolic. Some posts celebrated the project as a long overdue glow-up for the White House, arguing that America's premier building should be grand and impressive rather than cramped and outdated. Others shared images of the destruction with captions like, "This is what happens when you let a reality TV star run the country," viewing the demolition as symbolic of Trump's entire approach to governance, bulldozing norms and institutions without regard for consequences. The fact that Trump had appointed allies like Will Scharf and James Blair to leadership positions on the NCPC in July 2025, just months before the demolition began, raised additional concerns about whether proper oversight was even possible when the very bodies tasked with providing that oversight were controlled by political appointees loyal to the president. It created a situation where the president was effectively overseeing himself with predictable results. The Society of Architectural Historians and the DC Preservation League both expressed strong displeasure with the process, with some characterizing the new ballroom as potentially being an Emiratic carbuncle that would deform the White House's traditional aesthetic. The phrase Emiratic carbuncle was particularly pointed, evoking both Middle Eastern opulence and Prince Charles's famous criticism of modern architecture as monstrous carbuncles on beloved buildings. As the demolition neared, with the entire East Wing expected to be razed by the end of the month, speculation turned to potential legal challenges. Several preservation organizations were reportedly considering lawsuits, though the legal path forward was complicated by questions of standing and jurisdiction. Could private citizens or organizations sue to stop construction on the White House grounds? Did Congress have authority to intervene even though the project was privately funded? These were questions without clear precedents. What seemed certain was that the controversy would extend well beyond the actual construction timeline. The project wasn't scheduled for completion until September 2027, meaning that for nearly 2 years, the White House would remain a construction site, a constant visual reminder of the debates that the project had sparked. And political operatives on both sides were already contemplating how the ballroom would play in the 2028 presidential campaign. For Democrats, the ballroom offered a perfect symbol of everything they argued was wrong with Trump's approach to governance: the prioritization of personal grandeur over public service, the willingness to bulldoze norms and traditions, the cozy relationships with wealthy donors and corporate interests, and the tone-deaf pursuit of luxury projects while ordinary Americans struggled. The fact that 53% of Americans disapproved of the demolition in polls suggested this could be potent political material. For Republicans defending Trump, the ballroom represented practical modernization, unfairly attacked by partisan opponents who had remained silent when previous presidents made changes. They argued that private funding eliminated the strongest criticism, that taxpayer money was being wasted, and that future presidents and the nation would benefit from enhanced capabilities for diplomatic functions and state events. The truth, as is often the case, likely lay somewhere in the complicated middle. The White House did have real functional limitations when it came to hosting large events, and there were legitimate arguments for expansion and modernization. The building's infrastructure was aging, and security requirements had evolved dramatically since the East Wing was last significantly modified in 1942. The current East Room's capacity of around 200 guests was genuinely limiting for modern diplomatic needs, but the manner in which this particular expansion was being pursued, the circumvention of normal oversight processes, the opaque donor arrangements with obvious potential conflicts of interest, the demolition of a historic wing rather than a more respectful approach to expansion, and the tone-deaf timing during a government shutdown and period of economic inequality, all combined to create a controversy that transcended the merits of the underlying idea. The comparison to Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate was inescapable and deliberate. Trump had specifically drawn inspiration from his Florida property's gilded ballrooms, and the Versailles-inspired design with its extensive gold leafing and ornate decoration was very much in keeping with Trump's personal aesthetic preferences. But what worked for a private club catering to wealthy members didn't necessarily translate appropriately to the White House, which had traditionally maintained a more restrained elegance befitting its role as the people's house, rather than a monument to any individual individual president, the capacity for up to 999 people raised eyebrows for another reason. It seemed specifically calibrated to remain just under the 1,000-person threshold that would trigger additional regulations and requirements. Whether this was strategic planning or coincidence, it contributed to a sense that every aspect of the project had been carefully structured to minimize oversight and maximize presidential control. The ballroom, whenever it is finally completed, would stand as a physical monument to the Trump presidency in a way that few presidential projects ever had. Future visitors to the White House would walk through its gilded halls and form their own judgments about what it represented: practical modernization or gilded excess, necessary expansion or historical desecration, generous private philanthropy or corrupting donor influence. The project's $250 to $300 million price tag made it one of the most expensive single additions to the White House in American history, even adjusted for inflation. To put that in perspective, Truman's complete gutting and reconstruction of the White House interior cost $5.7 million in 1948 dollars, equivalent to about $70 million today. Trump's single ballroom addition would cost 3 to 4 times what it took to completely rebuild the entire interior of the White House in the 1940s. What perhaps best encapsulated the divide over the project was the contrast between how supporters and critics viewed Trump's own statements about it. When Trump described his vision for grand parties and state visits and spoke of creating spaces worthy of America's standing in the world, supporters heard aspirational leadership and a president unwilling to settle for mediocrity. Critics heard narcissism and a president more concerned with throwing extravagant parties than addressing the real challenges facing ordinary Americans. That wraps up this video. For more interesting videos like this, check out the cards on your screen.